Okay, welcome. Welcome, everybody. Welcome, everybody, to this new seminar in Ecology and Evolution of Montpellier. For those of you who are online, as usual, you are in a webinar mode, which means that your microphones and cameras are automatically switched off. If you have any technical issue, please use the chat to report to us, and we will try to help you solving the problem. Otherwise, if you have questions for today's speaker, please use the Q&R tab to ask your question. And when the question time comes, we will allow you to open your mic to ask your question directly. And Isabelle, I give you the floor to introduce today's speaker.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Isabelle Schun. I'm a researcher at CEF, and it's my pleasure today to introduce Olivia Haas, who is a visiting scientist at CEF in the forecast group. Olivia is part of an EU project called FireAdapt, which gathers CEF, but also AMAP and other European and South American universities. The project aims at building new fire management strategies to mitigate climate change impacts. She has just finished her PhD with Sandy Harrison and Colin Prentice at Imperial College London, and she's working at the Wildfire Centre, which gathers researchers from the University of Reading, Imperial College and King's College. Her PhD work identified the main causal relationships between the environment and fire traits like fire size, intensity, etc., under current climate conditions. And then she tested the reliability of those relationships in the far past using fire records, and finally proposed new models to project future fire regimes. So her work contributes also to the Colin Prentice new approach of eco-evolutionary optimality to reinvent global vegetation models that was presented last Friday here. And now Olivia is starting a postdoctorate within another project, the Lemon-Tree project at the University of Reading, to develop new generation fire modules in land surface models. And so today she's going to present the conceptual framework, the new methodology and results she obtained during her PhD.
Thank you. Thank you. And thanks for being here. So yeah, my name is Olivia Haas. I know some of you might have been expecting Sandy Harrison, so I won't live up to that, but hopefully this will still be enjoyable. So that was a really good introduction of my work. Essentially, for those of you that were at the presentation last week with Ian Colin Prentice, this work fits at the intersection between the kind of realm, which has now moved on to the Lemon-Tree project, of reinventing simpler theory to simplify global land surface models, and work within the Leverhulme Wildfires Centre, which is a new 10-year project looking at wildfires from an interdisciplinary perspective. So it has work both from a modelling, but also remote sensing and kind of sociology, human perspective. And so The work I did during my PhD and the work I'm going to be doing during my postdoc sits between these two projects, essentially trying to integrate wildfire modeling into this new approach of land surface modeling. So why do we care about fire in land surface models? Well, this is a map and it was meant to be an animation, so you're welcome to go to the website because it's a really interesting animation of burn area on Earth from 2000 to 2020, I believe. And what you see is this kind of seasonal cycle of burning, as well as the fact that burning occurs pretty much everywhere on Earth. So every year, around 4 to 8% of all vegetated areas burn. And this is not a new phenomenon. In fact, we've seen wildfire in charcoal records occur basically at the same time as terrestrial plants occur on Earth, so around 420 million years ago. And this means that fire is most certainly fundamental to the spatial distribution of vegetation on Earth. But another reason that wildfires are kind of being brought into this effort is current trends that we're seeing in fire regimes. So on the one hand, you've probably seen in the news, there's increasing attention on larger, more intense and dangerous wildfires occurring in places like Canada, Chile, Australia. But then on the other hand, if we look at the global satellite data of burnt area over the last kind of decade, we actually see a declining trend. So globally, we're seeing less and less burning. And this is primarily attributed to agricultural intensification and just in general cropland expansion, most predominantly over sub-Saharan Africa, which you can see from this map has a lot of the global burnt area. It accounts for about 80% of global burnt area. And so these opposing and diverging trends has really kind of led to attention to the question of how well do we actually model global wildfire regimes, and therefore how well can we know what might happen in the future? And the answer to this is relatively well, but so we have over 20 years now of global wildfire model development and a whole range of different fire models. So you don't actually need to see this figure, but these are essentially all the different state-of-the-art fire models and all of the different processes that they may or may not include. And we have a huge variety of complexity within the state-of-the-art global fire models. We have some process-based, quite complex fire models, which simulate all aspects of kind of individual fires and scale up globally. But we also have quite simple empirical models such as Inferno, which just use statistical relationships, basically. And what we see is that although we have all of these different models, they actually do relatively similar in terms of performance. And they do quite well when we look at spatial patterns. So up here in panel 8 is the combined remote sensing data of the spatial patterns of that area. And then from B to J are all the kind of state-of-the-art models. And apart from the two oldest ones, which were developed before remote sensing, which is MC2 and the blob firm in F over there, they actually do quite well. But we're stagnating in terms of our ability to reproduce interannual trends. So this is in gray kind of the uncertainty of the observations from 2002 to 2012, and you can see that it's not great. And yeah, in general, we haven't been able to robustly, with all of these state-of-the-art models, reproduce the global declining trend in burnt area. In addition to this, we also see that when we project backwards, so to the 1900s, we have huge divergence in what these models simulate. So although they relatively agree in terms of the modern period on which they're trained, we're struggling to kind of robustly project consensus in terms of trends over the last century. So this means that we're very uncertain about future wildfire trends within the modeling community, because if we can't kind of accurately have historical projections, we don't have huge certainty in the robustness of future projections. Now, this is because the drivers of fire regimes are very complex. So on the one hand, climate and fire weather and danger greatly influences wildfires. And lots of studies have been showing that fire weather will increase in the future. But this doesn't necessarily mean that we'll see increasing wildfires everywhere on Earth, because wildfires are also driven by human activity, who greatly influence their trends, which we can see, for example, from the global decline, which has been attributed to human activity. And also independently from climate vegetation, because in order for there to be a wildfire, you also do need vegetation to burn. And the type of vegetation, the seasonality, the phenology of that vegetation will affect the type of wildfire that we see. And there's a lot of uncertainty still in the drivers of these two other aspects, meaning that although we have climate fire weather increases, we are unsure about future increases in wildfires. Another thing that's worth mentioning is that all of the global fire models are simulating burnt area. The burnt area just represents the fractional kind of amount of burning within a grid cell. And not all wildfires are the same. So, for example, a crown fire burning in Portugal, in Canada is not the same as a grassland fire burning in savannas in terms of the effect on vegetation, in terms of the effects on human property, and also just in general, the fire regime. So we still have a lot of limited understanding about the global controls of fire properties beyond burnt area. No empirical global model that was included there actually simulates size, extent, and intensity. We also have limited understanding when it comes to the fire vegetation interactions. And this is something that's been highlighted as a key kind of reason for the deficiency along with human activity in what we see in our global fire models. Now, specifically in this, we don't know much about how the physiological effect of CO2 on vegetation impacts wildfires, and also the importance of fire-adapted vegetation traits and that interaction there. So the things I've highlighted in bold are what I concentrated on in my PhD. And then throughout my postdoc, we're going to be trying to look at how we can integrate these two to really kind of get a better understanding of different aspects of the fire regime and their interactions with vegetation. So for the PhD, we wanted to go back to the basics and really just ask the question, how do the spatial controls of burnt area, fire size, and fire intensity differ? So what are their global controls and are they different? And then we also wanted to explore the sensitivity of each of these three properties to climate, CO2 levels, and human activity independently. And we wanted these results to be simple and interpretable, to use them as the foundations to build up new theory about wildfire regimes and vegetation. So we used a statistical modeling approach, and we fitted 3 generalized linear models. So these are essentially multiple regressions, but using a link function for burnt area, fire size, and fire intensity, to a set of common predictors representing climate, vegetation, and the effect of CO2 on vegetation specifically, human activity, and topography. Now, I'm not going to go into huge detail about this, but this is the paper if you're interested. You can check that out. Now, the first step was to fit underlying linear relationships between the predictors and the fire property. And once we had these linear relationships, we then wanted to observe the relative importance of the different predictors in the controls of that fire property. And then finally, apply counterfactual experiments to explore the sensitivity of these different predictors to large change in the conditions. Now, we used a climatological approach because we wanted these models to be able to essentially simulate decadal to century change in conditions. So we collected monthly data, but we summarized those different months into an average climatology and then extract a single statistic for each of the variables from that climatology from this common set. Then we fitted this to climatologies of burnt area, fire size, and fire intensity, and only retained predictors that were significant at a very high p-value, and making sure that the variance inflation factors were below 5, which basically means that we can account for potential correlation and multi-collinarity between these predictors, because a lot of them are highly correlated. And then we use t-values to assess the relative importance of the predictors. Now, I just want to point this out because this is an important part of the analysis. We are fitting underlying relationships, but that doesn't mean that we're not capturing emergent ones. So this is quite a famous example of an emergent relationship. Here you have monthly precipitation and annual burnt area, and we see a humped relationship. So basically, annual burnt area is highest at kind of intermediate precipitation levels. And this can be explained by 2 monotonically increasing relationships interacting. So on the one hand, we have annual GPP, which is just like fuel, that's increasing with burnt area. So the more fuel, all things being equal, that you add, the more burning you get. And then we have monthly precipitation, which all else being equal, the more water you add to the system, the less burning you get. And this kind of leads to the emergence of fuel limited and dryness limited regions on Earth, where one of these relationships is kind of driving and more important, which emerges this like hump relationship here. So this is what we were trying to do, but for all these different predictors and biovariables. So what we saw from the free GLMs is that burnt area was primarily limited by fuel availability and fuel dryness. Now, this isn't a new result. A lot of this has been kind of established and discussed. Fire intensity, however, was primarily limited by fuel buildup and fuel density. And both these models shared kind of similar predictors as their strongest driving variables, so things like GPP, so fuel, which we used as kind of a proxy for our fuel, atmospheric humidity as well, which is VPD, and then the number of dry days, so like your precipitation level. But we actually see that they tend to have opposing relationships. So whereas dryness kind of greatly influences positively, these are the t-values, and above 0 is a positive effect, below 0 is a negative effect, and then the size of the bar is how important that variable is in the model, in driving the model. So we see that for burnt area, dryness and vegetation productivity are very strong positive drivers. And these same drivers are kind of the negative drivers in fire intensity. And this is, well, we hypothesize this is due to the fact that for there to be kind of large fuel buildups, we need there to be enough GPP kind of constantly, but it is in areas of high productivity with large seasonality. And also it needs to be wet enough in the humidity levels for there to be this buildup and this upkeep of fuel. Fire size, however, was controlled by very different factors. So we see that factors promoting fuel continuity as well as fire spread were the most important. So these are things like roads and crops, and this is actually the model that had the highest sensitivity to human activity, but also general temperature range and wind, which kind of give you these daily conditions of spread. And so here we have them with, again, very kind of strong positive influences of wind and negative influences of roads and crops, which are stronger than in the other two models. So in terms of the first question, we can say that the global controls of burnt area, fire intensity, and size seem to be different. But then how do they respond to change? So an important factor here is that when we kind of look at the atmospheric controls of wildfire regimes on Earth, on the one hand, we have climate, so precipitation and temperature, but we also have the effect of CO2 on vegetation. And the problem is that the climate changes with increasing or decreasing CO2 levels, as does the effect of vegetation. So these two factors are temporally correlated, meaning that from observations alone, we can't attribute like the effect of one or the other. And so this means that we need to be able to disentangle the effects of climate change and CO2 change from each other. And to do this, we actually used out-of-sample experiments and counterfactual experiments. So we used the last glacial maximum, which occurred around 21,000 years ago. Now, at the last glacial maximum, we have CO2 levels of about 185 ppm and a much colder and drier climate. So these are just the latitudinal distributions of temperature and precipitation compared to present. So this is our 0 line here, so lower. Now we know that at the LGM, vegetation productivity and forest cover were greatly reduced. And we also know that biomass burning was greatly reduced from charcoal records. And a lot of this has been attributed to the colder and drier climates. But we also hypothesize that the low CO2 levels effect on vegetation will have contributed to this decrease in biomass burning. So we set up an experiment where we had our baseline scenario, which is essentially the modern day conditions on which we trained the free GLMs, with a baseline climate and baseline CO2. And then our scenario, which is essentially our out-of-sample experiment. So here, the last glacial maximum with a scenario climate and a scenario CO2. And these are both realistic experiments. And then we set up two sensitivity experiments where we have CO2 only and climate only change. So in the CO2 only, we keep our baseline climate at modern day conditions, but we drop our CO2 levels to 185 ppm. In the climate only scenario, we do the opposite. So we keep our CO2 levels at today's kind of 300 plus, well, 400 now, and then we drop our climate to LGM conditions. Now, you might ask how we do this. So this means that we need to decouple the climate and CO2. And to do this, we first need to explicitly account for the physiological effect of CO2 on vegetation, and then be able to create kind of counterfactual simulations. And we do this using two empirical models, Biome 4 and the P model. So Biome 4 is a biogeography, biogeochemistry coupled model, which simulates vegetation types. So essentially, we have trees, grass, shrubs, based on climate, CO2, soils, and latitude. So we input those ourselves. And then the P model is the productivity GPP model that Colin Prentice discussed last week, where we essentially can simulate GPP, again, based on climate inputs as well as CO2 inputs. And so what this means is that we can simulate GPP with modern day climate, but putting in CO2 levels of the LGM, or vice versa, decoupling our vegetation from our climate. So this is what we get in the two realistic experiments between modern day and LGM. If you look at burnt area, we see a substantial reduction at the LGM compared to present. And we see kind of complete exclusion of burning above 60 degrees north latitude. Now, there's about 3 to 4 times more grid cells in which burning is completely excluded compared to present. But in the cells in which we do see burning, we actually see increases in fire size and fire intensity. Now, in these realistic experiments, we can look at what predictors are driving these changes. So I've just selected a few of the predictors here, but basically for burnt area, we see that changes in GPP and grass cover are the largest contributor to the decrease that we see. These are the 3 different climate models, because we ran this for 3 different climate models to essentially account for variability in climate changes. For fire size, on the other hand, we see that the climate predictors are kind of the biggest driver in the increases that we see, and notably wind changes. Although, and I'll come back to this in a bit, in our coldest of models, the low atmospheric humidity levels tends to actually decrease the fire size. And then for fire intensity, we see that both CO2 and climate tend to have an effect. So we get changes due to GPP in grass, but also atmospheric humidity levels. Now, if we look at the sensitivity experiments and what they can tell us, so this is the sensitivity experiment with our modern day climate, but then LGM CO2 levels, sorry. This is actually where we see our largest reduction in burnt area of all the experiments. And this reduction is about 70%. So in the previous, we were about a 40% global reduction in burnt area, so this is quite substantially larger. And this is primarily driven by GPP. So we get these huge decreases due to very low GPP levels at this, under this experiment. When burning did occur, we actually see reduction in fire size, which is a different result to the kind of realistic LGM. And we hypothesize this is due to kind of patchier vegetation. So we essentially just have a lot less vegetation, but we do still see increases in fire intensity. Now, under the other sensitivity experiment, where we have LGM climate, but modern day CO2, we actually see that burnt area is very sensitive to the amplitude of climate change. So basically the climate model that we use, the climate inputs. So we have an increase of 48% burnt area in one of the models and a decrease of 40%, sorry, in another. So a large range. And this is primarily due to differences in the VPD predictions. So this is actually fire size, but it illustrates the same point. We see large increases in fire size in 2 of the models, but in the coldest of the models, the low values of VPD are really offsetting these increases in fire size. And this is the same in burnt area. So we have a high sensitivity to climate change. Now, we compared these results with sedimentary charcoal records. We compared it for all 3 of the fire properties because sedimentary charcoal records are an indication of burning, but which property of burning it is quite hard to distinguish. So we wanted to see if burnt area, fire size, or fire intensity patterns matched up best. We found that burnt area was the best kind of match, with about 50% of the positive changes compared to present in the sedimentary charcoal records showing up as positive in our simulation, and yeah, same with the negative. But importantly, we only saw this kind of match when we had both the CO2 and climate effect included. So when we only included CO2, we saw much too little burning. So the suppression was like huge. And none of the positive anomalies in the record show up as positive. They're all negative in the simulation. However, with the climate only, we have too much burning happening, and we see a lot less of the negative charcoal record showing up as negative in the simulation as well. So it really seems that the combination and including both these effects leads to the most realistic spatial pattern compared to the LGM. So yeah, we essentially have reduced burning at the LGM, but larger and more intense wildfire compared to the present under this scenario experiment. So this shows that the effect of CO2 on vegetation is significant independently of climate, but also that the amplitude of climate change, and specifically the amplitude of change in VPD relative to the other predictors, VPD being atmospheric humidity, is important independently from CO2 as well. So this was quite interesting, but we wanted to do the same in an out of sample experiment, in the future, where we would have the kind of opposing signal. So instead of low CO2 levels and kind of colder climate, we would have higher CO2 levels and a warmer climate to see whether or not the sensitivity is the same on both sides. So again, we did this for end of century to have kind of the same amount of forcing as the LGM. So we included two RCP scenarios, RCP 2.6 and RCP 6.0, with ppms between 400 and 650 essentially. And we have this hotter climate. So these are our latitudinal distribution again between precipitation and temperature. The signal on precipitation is not as clear as at the LGM. And in terms of what we expect, well, we have a lot of uncertainty because even within future simulations of global fire models, there isn't really kind of a huge agreement about what the trends are. We have areas of increases, area of decreases, it kind of depends. So again, we set up a sensitivity experiment with our realistic future where we have CO2, human activity, and climate set at realistic levels. Now, for the human activity, we used the SSP2 middle of the road scenario. We only did one human activity scenario, and this was to, just account for it, but we weren't really looking at the changes in human activity. Then we have our futures CO2 only, where we have two different CO2 only scenarios. Our futures climate only, our futures CO2 and climate. So we did one where we ran CO2 and climate, but we kept human activity at its modern day conditions. And then we also have one where we have only human activity changing to see as well whether the sensitivity to the human predictors was large or not. So these are the predicted changes in the fire regime under a high mitigation scenario. So this is the kind of change of 1.5 degree warming, RCP 2.6. And what we see is actually a global decrease of burn area still of around 20% compared to present. And this is primarily driven by large decreases in size, intensity, and burn area in the tropics, over India, and a few of these regions. However, we see large increases in the northern extratropics. So although the global signal is a continued decrease one, we have increasing burn area size and intensity in the northern extratropics and especially in the boreal regions. So we have about 30% more grid cells that are burning here than compared to modern, which means areas that weren't burning at the modern and that are burning today. So although we have a global decrease, we see still some areas with large increases in burnt area. This is broken down per bio, and this is where we still have this large signal of decrease in tropical grasslands and evergreen forests. Now, within the sensitivity analysis of this mitigation run, so this is kind of 1.5 degree warming, we see that when we only look at climate and CO2, we do not see a global decline of 20%. So this is really kind of coming out of this human activity within tropical regions. And in fact, they tend to amplify each other, which is a different result to the LGM. So at the LGM, we had our largest reduction under the CO2 only experiment. And when we had CO2 and climate changes, we actually see less reduction in burnt area. Here, we have more increases in burnt area when we include both climate and CO2. I hope that makes sense. So they amplify each other, whereas they dampen each other at the LGM. Now, we also see that the northern extratropics have increases in burnt area under both the climate-only scenario and the CO2-only scenario, meaning that the CO2-induced changes on vegetation in the boreal regions are driving increases and therefore are important as well. Under the low mitigation scenario, so this is now with a warming of about 2 to 4 degrees, we no longer have a global decreasing signal in burnt area. So here, burnt area increases in every single biome, including tropical regions, as a kind of overall signal, but we still see decreases in fire intensity and in fire size in some of these regions. Again, we have huge increases in the boreal regions, and this infringement of areas that are burning increases even more north. So we have even more increasing burnt area. Now, it's interesting that when we consider only the climate effect, so we don't consider the effect of CO2 on vegetation, we still see decreases within tropical biomes globally. And so again, this highlights the importance of the CO2 effect in amplifying the signal of increased burnt area. Also, when we only consider social economic changes, so human activity, we still see large decreases in tropical regions. So it's not that humans are no longer decreasing burnt area, it's just that the climate and CO2 effect is becoming stronger and therefore overriding the global signal. Oh, yeah. Also, overall, through all biomes, the changes in climate are more important under this scenario than the changes in CO2 vegetation, which again is a different signal to that of the LGM. At the LGM, the changes due to CO2 effects were much larger than those of climate. So we get a reversal here of the sensitivity. So under these kind of future scenarios, we see increased burning and larger and more intense wildfires compared to the present. So yeah. We see a spatial shift northwards of fire on Earth under these scenarios, which is kind of a reversal of the spatial shift south under the LGM. And this tends to be amplified by human activity with a real kind of suppression in these tropical regions. But we also see diverging trends under both a high and a low mitigation scenario. And again, this is in line with the results of the LGM, showing that the amplitude of climate change really changes the effect. So whether or not we have kind of 1.5 degree warming or 2, 3, we do tend to see quite different trends. So yeah, take home messages. We see that burnt area, fire size, and fire intensity do have different controls globally. And this is quite a significant result, given that empirically this hasn't really been considered within the modelling community. And so this means that we need to be thinking about modelling them somewhat independently because they may decouple in the future. In the same way that we see reduced burning and larger and more intense fires at the LGM, we could also see increased burning and larger and more intense fires in the future. We see that fire regimes are sensitive to changes in climate, vegetation, and human activity, and therefore we need to include all three, or at least try and quantify them robustly in our modelling efforts. And right now, in terms of vegetation and human activity, this is something that we're really struggling to do. So this is important for the modelling community. And I haven't talked about this much, but we obviously still have large uncertainties on human activity. So here we've really focused on the effect of CO2 on vegetation, but we also need better understanding of the relationship between people and fire in order to have a kind of complete analysis here. So the next step after this, is really to kind of dive into the fire vegetation controls and interactions. We've seen that burnt area and fire intensity are most sensitive to vegetation and GPP, and we've looked at the effect of CO2 on vegetation and therefore on fire. But we also want to include an analysis on plant traits and see whether or not different kinds of plant traits can explain the distribution and establishment of fire regimes in order to move away from PFT-based parameters, which we currently have in our global fire models. And so the idea is to use the basis of this to kind of move towards developing an eco-evolutionary theory for fire vegetation And so that's what, like, hopefully we're going to be doing during my postdoc and in the next few years. Thank you very much. And yeah.
Thank you, Olivia. Is there some questions in the room or?
Gonna break the ice. Thanks for your interesting and very detailed talk. I have lots of questions. Many. Starting from one, you showed a figure with the T values, I think, showing the importance of different factors for biology characteristics. And I seem to recall that trees seem to have a negative influence on fire.
Yeah.
That's a little bit counterintuitive to me, at least.
Yeah. Maybe I'll go back to the. Is this working? Yeah. So again, this is because it's fitted. Go back to the map. Yeah. Yeah. So globally, we actually tend to see the bulk majority of burnt area in grassland savanna type ecosystems. So that kind of makes up the majority of the burnt area signal. And actually forests, although they burn a lot less frequently than these grassland systems. So with burnt area, which is essentially a bit of a proxy for frequency, we see a negative relationship. But for example, with fire intensity, the tree relationship is positive. So it's the type of fire occurring in forests that's somewhat different to that of like grasslands. So yeah, globally, trees don't tend to be the bulk majority of burning. It's much more kind of grassy systems, if that makes sense.
From paleorecord point of view, the landscape changes from forest dominated by an open environment.
Yeah.
So an open environment where agriculture has been taking place. There's less forest cover, but eventually there's more fires because
it's an open landscape.
Because it's an open landscape, and eventually humans are setting fire.
Well, yes and no. So I forgot to mention, but our LGM experiment, we actually set our human activity predictors to 0 in both the modern and the LGM to only be comparing the sensitivity of climate and CO2. So we don't have any kind of human influence at the LGM in our experiments. And we did run to kind of test, like based on archaeological records and stuff of population density estimates, the effect if we did include humans, and we saw very little change, like less than kind of 2-3% back at the LGM. And we do also know that fires were occurring in savannas and open systems before the establishment of humans. So I think that trend is there regardless of human activity, but we also do tend to see, obviously, a human influence in open landscapes as we move forward in the record. Yeah. Other questions?
The models you show are the result of data collected in the world.
Yeah.
What happens if you concentrate the work on the specific area like the Mediterranean basin?
So as in just do it based on the Mediterranean?
Right?
You mean like fit the models just to a specific area?
Just to Mediterranean data.
Yeah. So we're actually in the process of doing this for France and like refitting it in France. My hypothesis would be that some of the relationships would potentially change due to the fact that we wouldn't necessarily have, the same variety of data, and we wouldn't be fitting to the same distribution. But no, we haven't specifically looked at a regional set yet and looked at how the relationships would change. Does that answer the question?
A question about the GPP. So you use models, a P model.
Yeah.
Yeah, very important. So how much your model is, yeah, your results might be sensitive to this model, which might be different in terms of impact of CO2 or climate.
Yeah, so obviously we're using the P model and it's sensitive to the P model. We did run modern day simulations using other GPP products to see whether or not the predictions change. So we used GPP outputted from Joules, which is the land surface model that the UK EFM uses. And we saw the same kind of trend. So it didn't seem that sensitive to that model specifically, but it is true that given the assumptions of the climate effect and the CO2 effect in the P model, that would translate and propagate through into these. But yeah.
Thank you for the presentation. I have a question. Does your model show the emergence of pyrocumulus cloud that could create their own fire system?
No, definitely not. So yeah, one of the things that these models don't do is simulate in any sort because it's based on your kind of median conditions. So no, it's a simple answer to that.
But it could be interesting to see emergence of new phenomena.
Yeah, I think I was talking about this with a few people that are in extreme wildfire kind of modeling, and they were saying that even just using the approach but on a different distribution and like looking at how these events propagate in under different settings. So yeah, definitely. Thank you.
Thank you. A last question for me. So you say that you need to take into account climate, vegetation, and human activity to predict correctly fire regimes. And it seems obvious to do that. But does it mean that previous models did not take into account all these three different factors?
No, so they do. They do account for these effects, but the way in which they do is very much a kind of let's add in this parameter and then let's add in this parameter. So for example, with human activity, we see process-based models that have kind of hard-coded relationships with population density, where we assume at low population densities an increasing effect of burn area. And then there's a kind of cutoff value, which I think in some models is five people per kilometer squared or something like that. And then afterwards, we have a decreasing effect. And the problem is that these are hard-coded into the processes. So it's very hard now to know which element is causing the divergence and to compare the models. So the point of this work isn't necessarily to say they haven't accounted for it, but it's let's disentangle the effects, look at them one at a time, and try and see where we could be missing, missing our model development, essentially.
Okay. Thank you very much, Olivia. Thank you, everyone. This is the end of this SEM.
Ouais. Alors, en fait, là, ouais, exactement. Et alors, forcément,